I sat across from Jeffrey at Victoria's High Society anniversary gala. He leaned in, his eyes hard. "Hand over the birthday envelope for my mother," he hissed. The illusion of our marriage instantly shattered. I didn't panic. Instead of the cash they expected, I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy manila envelope containing legal notices of mortgage fraud. "Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." We built our lives in Columbus, Ohio. At least, I thought it was a joint venture. Looking back at the foundational 11 years of our marriage, I realize now it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. I was a middle school science teacher, balancing grading papers with raising a severely sick child. My son's medical needs were a constant, terrifying weight. Meanwhile, Jeffrey was a corporate logistics manager, pulling in a handsome salary. He had convinced me his base pay was heavily tied up in complex corporate stock options, deferred bonuses, and mandatory retirement contributions, while he secretly routed the cash equivalents elsewhere. Yet, somehow, I became the sole financial spine of our household. I paid the mortgage on the independent home I owned before we ever met. I paid for the groceries. I paid for the electricity that kept my son's medical equipment running. I convinced myself this was just how partnerships worked when one person was building their career. But anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I was balancing the books of my life and realizing I was bankrupt. The truth was far more calculated. Jeffrey had been covertly funneling 80% of his corporate salary directly to Victoria to fund her lavish lifestyle. 80%. While I lay awake, terrified about my son's life-saving medical treatment remaining unfunded, my husband was subsidizing his mother's country club memberships. It is terrifying how easily we normalize our own exploitation. You do not wake up one day and decide to be a victim. It happens by inches. A missed utility payment here, a temporary loan there. The trap of cruel normalization conditions you to accept the unacceptable, wrapping financial abuse in the guise of family duty. I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of a family. They did not see a devoted wife and mother. They saw a functional resource, a subsidized housing provider. Every excuse Jeffrey made about tight budgets and bad investments was a calculated line item in a fraudulent ledger. The normalization of this cruelty was their greatest weapon. They relied on my empathy, my exhaustion, and my desperate need to keep the peace for my son's sake. They relied on me being too tired to look closely at the bank statements. They banked on my silence. But the moment I saw the numbers, the empathy evaporated. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for the end of my marriage. But there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I didn't cry for the 11 years I had lost. I simply opened my mental ledger and started calculating exactly what they owed me. I had normalized their theft for over a decade. Now, I was going to normalize their destruction. My marriage wasn't a romance. It was a hostile takeover. I had funded their lifestyle with my sweat and my son's health. I wiped the slate clean of any lingering affection. They weren't family. They were a bad debt, and I was about to collect. The turning point arrived on a freezing February evening. The sleet was coming down in sharp diagonal sheets, coating the sidewalks of Columbus in a treacherous layer of ice. I had just returned from another exhausting shift at the middle school, followed by a terrifying visit to my son's specialist. My bones ached with the kind of fatigue that coffee cannot fix. I checked the mailbox out of pure habit. Instead of standard junk mail, a rigid, heavy official envelope bearing a certified legal courier stamp rested at the bottom. Inside, buried beneath routine utility bills I would have to pay alone, was a thick, certified envelope. I stepped inside the quiet house. Jeffrey was out, likely at another one of Victoria's endless social functions. The only light in the living room came from the soft, blue glow of my son's small fish tank. I didn't even bother turning on the overhead lights. I just stood there in the dim, aquatic glow and tore open the heavy paper. It was a title notice. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, my scientific mind automatically parsing the data. It was a deed of trust amendment. Someone had taken out a loan against my premarital home. The amount glared up at me from the page. $85,000. I stared at the number. $85,000. The exact amount required for my son's specialized medical treatment. The treatment Jeffrey had sworn we could never afford. The treatment I had been desperately trying to crowdfund, selling my belongings to save for, weeping in doctors' offices over. My heart didn't race. My breathing didn't hitch. I felt an absolute freezing calm wash over me. I looked closer at the documents. The loan was secured through an unfamiliar limited liability company called Westmore Capital Group. But what locked the ice in my veins was the final page. There, at the bottom of the amendment, was my signature. Except I hadn't signed it. The loop of the letter was too wide, the slant entirely wrong. It was a forgery. A clumsy, desperate forgery. Someone had stolen my identity, leveraged the only asset I own, and extracted $85,000 right out from under me. I didn't ask why. I didn't collapse onto the floor in despair. Despair is for people who still have hope. I had data. My husband and his mother had committed federal mortgage fraud. They had robbed my sick child of his future to finance their present. The anger was so absolute it felt like a physical tool in my hands. Every forged curve of my name on that document was a nail in their coffin. They thought I was naive enough to remain ignorant forever. They underestimated the methodical nature of a science teacher. I categorized the evidence, filed the emotions away, and prepared for war. The freezing sleet outside was nothing compared to the absolute zero temperature of my resolve. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a felony. The next morning, I moved with absolute precision. I took a personal day from the middle school and sat down with my most loyal confidant, my coworker Teresa. Teresa was sharp, fiercely protective, and knew exactly how to keep a secret. She didn't offer empty platitudes or useless pity. Instead, she immediately connected me with Vera Sutton, a ruthless real estate attorney who specialized in mortgage fraud. I sat in Vera's downtown office, sipping bitter coffee while she ran a full, expedited title search on my property. The results were worse than I could have imagined. Vera slid a second file across her massive oak desk. There wasn't just one forged document, there was a second fraudulent instrument, a quitclaim deed. And the terrifying truth behind the shell company emerged in stark, undeniable print. Westmore Capital Group wasn't some faceless corporate lender. It was a private entity managed entirely by Marcus. Marcus, the slick, wealthy man who had recently become Victoria's new husband. The architecture of their conspiracy was breathtaking. Victoria and Jeffrey hadn't just forged my name. They had colluded with Marcus to legally strip the equity from my home and launder it into Victoria's newlywed lifestyle. They were a syndicate of thieves masquerading as family. I sat in that leather chair and reflected on my years of silent endurance. For a decade, I had swallowed my pride, absorbed their insults, and paid their bills. People might look at that and see weakness. They might ask why I stayed, why I didn't fight back sooner. But that misunderstands the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are trapped in a system of prolonged emotional and financial abuse, especially with a sick child depending on you, silence isn't submission. It is a calculated survival mechanism. You learn to read the room, to measure the exact amount of oxygen you are allowed to consume without triggering an explosion. You endure because fighting a daily war drains the energy you need to keep your child alive. My silence had been my armor. It allowed me to observe, to collect data, and to map the exact dimensions of my prison. It kept Jeffrey complacent and Victoria arrogant. They mistook my tactical endurance for stupidity. They thought my invisible chains meant I was permanently broken. They were wrong. The chains were just a tether, and now I had the key. Vera outlined the legal reality. We had them dead to rights: forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy. But I didn't want to just file a police report and let the system handle it quietly. A quiet resolution wouldn't balance the ledger. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror I felt every time I looked at my son's medical bills. I instructed Vera to draft the formal notices of fraudulent lien disputes, but to hold off on filing them immediately. I needed time. I needed them comfortable. I thanked Teresa for the introduction, paid Vera her retainer, and walked out into the cold Columbus air. The survivor was gone. The architect of their downfall had taken her place. I was going to sever their invisible chains and wrap them tightly around their own throats. The hardest part of any tactical strike is the waiting. For 3 agonizing weeks, I maintained a facade of absolute domestic calm. I performed normalcy with the precision of a seasoned actor. I woke up at dawn, prepared my son's medications, and graded science quizzes at the kitchen island. Every evening, I cooked dinner for Jeffrey. I stood over the stove, carefully stirring pasta sauce, while he sat at the dining table, his face illuminated by the glow of his smartphone. He would chuckle at a text, his thumbs flying across the screen. When I asked him who he was messaging, he would offer a dismissive wave of his hand. Just Victoria, he would mutter, not even bothering to look up. She needs help with the country club gala. I didn't throw the boiling water at him. I didn't smash his phone against the granite countertops. I simply smiled, placed his dinner plate in front of him, and asked if he needed extra Parmesan. Anger wasn't loud. It was a spreadsheet, and I was just verifying the final rows of data. I poured him a glass of wine, smiling as he complained about how expensive life was getting. I nodded sympathetically, knowing the $85,000 they stole was sitting in Marcus's accounts. My performance was flawless. During the day, I stood in front of my 8th grade science class, but I found myself incorporating lessons from the English department. I taught my students about dramatic irony. I explained how it functions as a narrative device, how tension is built when the audience knows a critical piece of information that the characters inside the story do not. Imagine, I told my classroom of wide-eyed middle schoolers, watching a character walk confidently toward a door, completely unaware that a trap is waiting on the other side. The power belongs entirely to the observer. As I spoke the words, the profound practical application of that narrative perspective washed over me. I was the audience. I was the author. Jeffrey, Victoria, and Marcus were just oblivious characters, acting out a script I'd already finished reading. I knew the ending of their story long before they even realized the climax was approaching. They thought they were the masterminds of a brilliant financial heist. They thought I was the clueless, exhausted wife, too bogged down by medical bills and grading rubrics to notice an $85,000 hole in my property value. This perspective advantage gave me immense power. Every time Jeffrey lied to my face, he wasn't deceiving me. He was just performing his lines. I documented everything. I noted the dates, the times he claimed to be working late but was actually finalizing the fraudulent paperwork with Marcus. I watched them build their house of cards higher and higher, knowing that I already held the match. Performing normalcy required discipline, but it was fueled by the absolute certainty of their impending destruction. The stage was set, the trap was primed, and the actors were in position. The dramatic irony was perfectly calibrated. I just had to wait for the curtain to rise. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place during my second meeting in Vera Sutton's austere downtown office. The thick mahogany doors closed, shutting out the noise of the city, leaving only the cold, hard facts spread across the table. Vera had completed the deep dive into the financial forensics. The full scope of the white-collar conspiracy was laid bare, and its sheer audacity was breathtaking. Vera pointed a manicured finger at the highlighted sections of the documents. Between the forged signatures on the initial deed of trust amendment and the subsequent filings, they had escalated their theft. The second instrument wasn't just a minor administrative change. It was a fraudulent quitclaim deed, effectively transferring a 50% ownership interest in my premarital home directly to Victoria. They hadn't just borrowed against my property, they had actively tried to steal half of it to secure Victoria's financial portfolio with Marcus. But the revelations didn't stop at the property line. Vera had managed to legally subpoena Jeffrey's banking records as part of the preliminary fraud investigation. The systematic draining of his corporate salary was meticulously documented. For 11 years, 80% of his substantial income had bypassed our joint accounts entirely. It was automatically routed into a private trust managed by Victoria. He hadn't just been cheap. He had been conducting a decade-long embezzlement scheme against his own family. He had watched me struggle to pay for our son's specialized oxygen equipment while his six-figure bonuses bought his mother luxury vehicles. I stared at the bank statements, the ink blurring slightly before my absolute focus snapped it back into sharp relief. I didn't feel heartbreak. Love had been fully replaced by the sterile mechanics of a contract dispute. I realized in that moment that I had never been a partner in my own marriage. I had been a functional resource, an unwitting silent investor underwriting their aristocratic fantasies. I was the utility company, the landlord, and the nurse, while Jeffrey and Victoria played the roles of wealthy socialites. "This isn't just civil," Vera stated, her voice devoid of any bedside manner. "This crosses multiple federal lines. We have Marcus acting as the registered agent for Westmore Capital Group, knowingly processing forged quitclaim deeds. We have wire fraud. We have identity theft." "Lock the trap," I told her, my voice as steady as concrete. "I want the dispute notices finalized. I want the injunctions ready to file." This wasn't about revenge in some chaotic, emotional sense. This was accounting. They had run up a massive deficit on my balance sheet, and I was initiating an aggressive collection protocol. I instructed Vera to prepare the certified service packets. Every document was triple-checked, every legal loophole welded shut. They had built a massive web of conspiracy, thinking they were spiders catching a fly. They didn't realize they had woven their web around a hornet. I gathered the files, placing them carefully into my briefcase. The weight of the paper felt like justice in its rawest form. I wasn't just going to burn their house of cards, I was going to salt the earth underneath it. The accounting was complete. It was time to serve the invoice. Victoria's exclusive anniversary gala was held in the grand ballroom of the most opulent, upscale hotel in the city. The space was a monument to their stolen wealth, dripping in pale gold decor and illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers that fractured the light into 1,000 blinding shards. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne, while the city's elite mingled, blissfully unaware that the entire evening was funded by a dying child's medical budget and a forged quitclaim deed. I sat at our designated table, the pristine ivory tablecloth stark and clean under the ambient lighting. Jeffrey sat directly across from me. He was wearing a tailored tuxedo, sipping a bourbon, and projecting the image of a successful, devoted family man. I watched him smooth his lapel, his face relaxing into an expectant smirk as he caught my eye. He gave a subtle, impatient nod toward his mother, who was holding court at the head table, draped in diamonds that I had essentially paid for. This was my cue. This was the moment I was supposed to perform my traditional role of the subservient peacekeeper. The script dictated that I would stand up, walk over with my head bowed in deference, and hand Victoria an envelope stuffed with cash as a tribute to her matriarchal status. For a decade, I had played this part flawlessly, absorbing the subtle snubs and condescending whispers from her high society friends to keep the peace for Jeffrey. The music swelled, a string quartet playing something aggressively classical. Jeffrey's smirk faltered as I remained seated. I didn't move a muscle. I just stared at him, my expression completely flat, devoid of any of the anxious compliance he was used to seeing. He leaned across the ivory tablecloth, the smell of his expensive cologne suddenly nauseating. "Why are you just standing there?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper so the other guests wouldn't hear. "Give my mother the money envelope. Stop being difficult and just do it." He expected me to flinch. He expected the invisible chains to yank me into line. Instead, I broke the script completely. I didn't cry. I didn't whisper an apology. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It wasn't the small, elegant stationery they expected. It was dense with legal weight. I looked at Jeffrey, my eyes locking onto his with clinical detachment. "I brought an envelope," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the music, sharp enough to cut glass. "But it isn't cash." They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. The dramatic irony had reached its peak. The entire ballroom was a theater, and I was about to deliver the final act. Every step across that plush carpet was a reclamation of my power. I wasn't the silent investor anymore. I was the hostile takeover. Jeffrey scrambled to his feet, a flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through his arrogant smirk. He reached out to stop me, but I stepped past him effortlessly. The performance of our marriage was officially canceled. The ivory tablecloths and crystal chandeliers were about to witness a brutal financial reckoning. I reached the head table just as Victoria was raising a crystal flute for a toast. Marcus stood beside her, beaming with the unearned pride of a successful grifter. The conversation around them died down as I stopped directly in front of the centerpiece. I didn't wait for permission to speak. I didn't smile. "Victoria, Marcus," I announced calmly, my voice projecting with the clear, unyielding authority of a teacher silencing a chaotic classroom. I dropped the heavy manila envelope squarely onto her pristine plate. "Consider yourselves formally served, with certified notices of fraudulent lien disputes, naming you both, alongside Westmore Capital Group." The silence in the immediate vicinity was absolute. Victoria's champagne flute hovered, frozen in the air. Marcus's smile vanished, replaced by the rigid panic of a criminal caught in the act. Jeffrey leaped up from our table behind me, charging forward in fury. "Emily, what the hell are you doing? Are you insane?" he shouted, grabbing my arm. I shook him off effortlessly. "Don't touch me," I said coldly. "You can't do this here." Jeffrey panicked, his face red. "You don't understand the Westmore loan. It was just a temporary hold. I was going to pay the $85,000 back." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests. In his blind panic to shut me down, Jeffrey had just accidentally exposed his deep, guilty knowledge in front of 50 witnesses. He had publicly confirmed the exact dollar amount of the fraudulent loan without me even mentioning it. He had essentially confessed. I turned to face him, the final pieces of the puzzle locking into place for everyone to see. "You forged my signature to secure an $85,000 debt against my home," I stated, the volume of my voice clinical and precise. "You diverted 80% of your salary to fund your mother's lifestyle, while our son's life-saving medical treatment went unfunded. I know about the quitclaim deed. I know about Marcus. I know everything." Victoria finally found her voice, shrill and trembling. "You manipulative little," she hissed, dropping her glass. "You're ruining my anniversary." "This isn't revenge, Victoria," I replied, looking down at her with absolute detachment. "It is accounting. You forged a partnership into a hostile acquisition. I am simply liquidating your assets to balance my books." I turned my back on them. I didn't wait for security. I didn't engage in a screaming match. I had delivered the facts, served the legal papers, and exposed their conspiracy in front of the very society they prized above all else. They were scrambling, shouting at each other, their perfect facade crumbling into a chaotic, criminal mess. I walked out of the ballroom, down the grand staircase, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cool night air. I stood on the pavement, breathing in the crisp atmosphere. I looked down at my hands. They were completely steady. The transaction was complete. The debt was called in, and for the first time in 11 years, I was entirely free. There was no sadness, no lingering doubt. I didn't look back at the hotel. I didn't care about the whispers echoing through the ballroom. Let them panic. Let Marcus try to call his lawyers. The trap Vera Sutton built was inescapable. I walked toward my car, the cold air feeling like a baptism. I was the sole owner of my life again. The aftermath was as swift and brutal as the service itself. Over a grueling, methodical, legal battle that stretched across extended court dockets, the system systematically dismantled their conspiracy piece by piece. Vera Sutton proved to be as relentless as promised. The court formally voided the fraudulent liens and the forged quitclaim deed, untangling my home from their criminal web with absolute finality. Federal prosecutors didn't take kindly to mortgage fraud and identity theft. Criminal charges were swiftly filed against Marcus and Victoria, and the looming prospect of federal prison quickly erased their high society arrogance. My divorce settlement was a flawless execution of legal strategy. Faced with irrefutable evidence of long-term financial abuse, salary diversion, and felony forgery, Jeffrey's lawyers folded without a fight. I secured absolute protection for my premarital home, full custody of my son, and a rigid financial judgment that garnished Jeffrey's remaining income to properly fund the life-saving medical treatments he had so casually neglected. They lost the money, they lost their status, and they lost their freedom. They were left with nothing but the devastating consequences of their own greed. I've come to realize that survival doesn't always look like quietly weathering the storm. Sometimes, true survival requires you to become the storm yourself. For over a decade, I believed that maintaining silence and enduring the financial drain was the only way to keep the peace and protect my sick child. I thought my endurance was a shield. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. I had to forgive myself for allowing the trap of cruel normalization to convince me I was merely a functional resource in their twisted narrative. The true cost of toxic domestic endurance is the slow, quiet erosion of your own worth. When you refuse to play the victim and anchor yourself in unyielding legal truth, the invisible chains finally shatter. I rebuilt my family's foundation on absolute clarity and justice. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. I proved that when you stop funding the people who hurt you, you finally have the resources to heal yourself. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to find your strength in the quietest moments, drop a comment below, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so we can continue decoding the stories that shape our lives together.